EU regulation seems absurd and intrusive. We don't like being bossed around by a bunch of bureaucrats. For the British, it seems to go against the grain.
There's a huge cultural difference. I've seen it for myself when I was in government, when I went to meetings of the Council of Ministers. They thought I came from another planet.
There is still in many parts of the continent a notion that the way that society should be organised is to have a class of wise, experienced, public-spirited experts who will run things in the best interests of all. The British historically have been deeply sceptical of this kind of approach.
Britain, I think, does stand out within Europe, and one of the odd things is why they want to keep us in the club, given that they're always complaining about us.
Why are British the cussed ones in Europe? Why are we so attached to our independence and freedom? Why do we take so badly to regulation? Where does it all come from? The British freed themselves from suffocating feudal regulation centuries before the Europeans. While serfdom still existed in large parts of Europe, the free British were carrying out the great commercial and industrial revolutions that gave birth to the modern world. In the 19th century, unregulated Britain was the pioneer of global free trade, workshop of the world, dominating the world economy like a leviathan. Even on the eve of the First World War, Britain was building around 60% of the world's commercial ships and owned almost half the world's cargo-carrying ocean-going steamers. But the First World War changed everything. New ministries were set up as the government extended its control over every aspect of British life. Industry became heavily regulated. First shipping, then the collieries, railways, canals, and agriculture.
The Great War is, in this as in many other respects, a great watershed in British history. During the war, there's incredibly detailed state control of a whole range of industries. By the end of the war, there's a feeling that there needs to be much more permanent regulation and control of society by the state.
A company was no longer private property. It was a national asset to be directed from above.
The government increasingly thought that it should plan, it should control, it should regulate.
When the war was over, so was the excuse for government regulation, and many were scrapped, but not all of them, and not for long.
British governments sought to deliberately cartelise and control the major sectors of the British economy, basically checking the spirit of initiative and innovation that had been such a dominant feature of the British manufacturing sector in the 19th century.
With World War II, regulation increased still further. War planning gave politicians and administrators unprecedented control over our lives. And after the war, they were unwilling to hand back their power.
We won the war, so we think that governments must be pretty good, and as a result, everything is then planned.
How we build houses, what houses should look like, how they should be decorated, who should live in them. Virtually every area of life, we had boards of experts working out the best way to do things.
A young couple has dropped in for advice on setting up home. First, they're shown how to avoid overcrowding a room. Always allow at least 18 inches between chairs and other furniture.
Everything from heavy industry down to clothes, food, and children's toys were regulated.
If you didn't manage a doll at Christmas, this is probably why. All restrictions on toy making have been lifted, but export has the first claim.
Britain became perhaps the most state-controlled and regulated economy in Europe. The regulation of business, trade, commerce of all kinds was much, much greater than anywhere else.
Regulations, price fixing, protectionism, supporting failed industries.
A heavily regulated economy, ordered from above, the politicians assured us, would be a screaming success. But the very opposite happened. The purpose of regulation was to end wasteful competition, but it was competition that had kept industry efficient and innovative. Nimble entrepreneurs who were rewarded for success and punished for failure were now replaced by plodding bureaucrats ticking boxes. Productivity and output plummeted. Shortages pushed up prices.
The buying power of the average wage, £5 to £6, has shrunk at an alarming rate.
But first among offenders in increasing prices was the government itself. Coal rose, affecting other industries. Electricity charges went up.
Then as we get more money, everything goes up, doesn't it? It must be this inflation they're all talking about.
For ordinary British consumers, life was grim. Goods were either unavailable, unaffordable, or heavily rationed.
Good news came with a sticky end to sweet rationing. For 9 years, mouths had watered for this great day. And it was too much of a tummy ache for the country's economy. And soon, personal points came back.
Over in Germany, it was a different story. The war had left Germany little more than smoking rubble. West Germany would receive some martial aid, but only less than half the amount sent to Britain.
At the end of the Second World War, Germany was a ruin. If you see the old footage, it was absolutely flattened.
Germany needed a miracle, and this was the man who performed it. In the first free elections after the war, Ludwig Erhard, the son of a shopkeeper, became Minister for the Economy, a post he held until 1963.
Ludwig Erhard began the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, by completely scrapping all of the controls that he'd inherited from the Third Reich, and he did this against the strong advice of his British superiors, you might say, in the occupied zone.
Erhard revolutionized the German economy because he just got rid of regulations on a massive scale. He got rid of production controls, price controls. He got rid of trade barriers.
They were happy to have open and free trade, a deregulated economy. They want to see industries stand on their own 2 feet, and those that can't must make way for those that can.
Germany was open to the world, you had much more free and easy entry into business and commerce and the professions in Germany, and the result was that the German economy became much more dynamic, much more innovative, and ultimately much, much more successful.
Just look how quickly Germany pulled itself off the floor.
Industrial production soared.
In Britain, there were shortages and rising prices. In Germany, goods were abundant and wages rose steeply.
The result for the ordinary person in Germany was sensational because the production of all consumer goods rose, the prices came down. Britain, who won the war, was still rationed for year after year after year, whereas Germany, who lost the war, rationing was abolished.
Before you know it, just a decade or two of this approach, and it's a powerhouse of Europe.
Contemporaries described it as a miracle. By the time Erhard left office, he had transformed Germany from a pile of smoking ruins to the third biggest economic power in the world. Then came something called the common market.
In the greatest free trade experiment of modern times, the barriers are going up between 6 European countries. Barriers up, tariffs down. That is the meaning of the common market, formed by France, Italy, Western Germany, with Holland, Belgium and Luxembourg. They will reduce and eventually abolish trade barriers between themselves and at the same time maintain a common tariff against the world outside.
Joining the EEC seemed like a great idea. It meant escaping the dismal, dreary confines of post-war Britain.
In the 70s, we had terrible problems. We had double-digit inflation, the 3-day week, prices and incomes policies, and we looked across the channel and we thought, these chaps are doing something right.
At that time, Britain was a very centralised place, a very over-bureaucratic and regulated place. Europe was a much more competitive and free-trading place, and it looked like the future. Europe was the future.
Europe meant sun and wine and fancy food like pasta. It meant going out into the world and opening up and hopefully becoming more like powerhouse Germany. But the architect of the EEC was not German. He was French. Jean Monnet was steeped in the French bureaucratic big state tradition. Indeed, he had spent the Second World War in Britain, helping to create the very regulations